In today's video, we're going to be taking a look at Pimax Play, the software that drives the Pimax Crystal series of VR headsets, and in particular I'll be making reference to the Crystal Super and Crystal Lite. And I'll be talking from a flight simmer's perspective using Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. We'll be exploring the settings to understand exactly what they do, and I'll also briefly touch on some of the other settings I'm using in the sim. Chances are, if you're watching this video, you've probably got a Pimax Crystal headset already, but if not and you're curious, then check out my reviews on both the Pimax Crystal Lite and Crystal Super, link in the notes below. Pimax Crystal Lite aimed at the mid-range and the Super aimed at the enthusiast. In my opinion, these two headsets offer excellent bang for your buck in their respective categories. Purchasing either of these headsets through the affiliated link in the notes below the video will offer a small 3% discount. I think it would be fair to say that Pimax had a bit of a reputation for some clunky software, but that's no longer the case with Pimax Play. It's an easy setup and configuration tool that helps you get up and running and get the best out of your VR headset. Most importantly, it's stable and solid. Both the Lite and the Super are high-resolution VR headsets. That is especially the case with the Super. Whilst Pimax Play has a number of performance-enhancing features, it can't perform miracles. Recommended as a 12th gen Intel CPU or AMD equivalent or above, and you need a graphics card with at least 16 GB of VRAM in my opinion to get the best out of these headsets. Personally, for the Pimax Crystal Lite, I recommend a 4070 Ti or preferably a 4070 Ti Super as a minimum, or AMD's 9070 XT, and for the Pimax Crystal Super, AMD's 9700 XTX, 4080 Super but preferably a 5080 or RTX 5090. My recommendations are above the minimum recommendations by Pimax, but are based on you being able to get the best out of the VR headset without too many compromises. I'd love to be in a position where I could say to you, use these settings and you'll get the best performance. But there's such a variety in terms of different PC configurations, video cards, system memory and CPU speeds, that simply is not possible. VR is a balancing act between the VR headset features and resolutions and your in-sim settings. The purpose of this video is to explain Pimax Play and explain briefly some of the in-sim settings to help you find the best settings for you. I've booted up my Pimax Crystal Super, so let's have a look at Pimax Play. Pimax are regularly updating Pimax Play. Keep your version updated. It does need to run in the background. I personally like to select the option Hide to Taskbar when closing the window, so it's not sat on my desktop. But when looking to change any of the settings, we're going to be heading over to Device Settings, and we'll start on the Devices tab. The first point to note is room lighting frequency. This affects the tracking to some small degree. Principally UK and Europe is 50 Hz and the States is 60 Hz. Can help prevent some loss of tracking and drifting. Pimax Crystal Super offers two modes, 90 Hz and 72 Hz. This is effectively selecting the refresh rate of your VR headset. Now, if you're able to achieve 90 FPS or 72 FPS respectively in sim, this will provide you with a smooth and stutter-free performance. With current hardware, that's going to be difficult to achieve. You do get the option to lock your frame rate to half the refresh rate. In the case of 90, that would be 45, and 72 would be 36. We'll cover this a bit later on, but you can do this either in sim or in the Pimax Play software. Some people can experience a little bit of discomfort at 72 Hz, and personally I prefer the 90 Hz mode. There's also an upscale mode here, and also for the Pimax Crystal Lite, if I recall correctly, there's a 90 Hz upscale mode. The upscale modes in essence are actually performance enhancers, renders the image at a lower resolution, then the image is upscaled to the desired resolution. This can cause the loss of some visual fidelity, but it's a matter of personal preference. Screen timeout is basically self-explanatory. It's how long the VR headset will remain on once you take it off your head. Common selections here are 20 seconds or 1 minute. As a content creator, I'm in and out the headset like a yo-yo, so I have mine set to 5 minutes. And below that you can set the brightness. You can enable or disable eye tracking if your headset has that option. If you do enable, make sure that you calibrate. Eye tracking is normally associated with dynamic foveated rendering, so if you use DCS, well, it's an absolute must. Foveated rendering is also supported in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. At the time of making this video, the auto IPD adjustment is just not working for me. I recommend that this is turned off, and that you set it manually. IPD in simple terms is the distance from the center of one eye to the other. Use that only really as a guide. My IPD is 62mm, but I find 61mm works best for me in Pimax Play. Setting this correctly is very important. The 3D image you see in VR is one image overlapped with the other. If your eyes are not aligned with the overlap, it can cause eye strain and blur your visuals. In flight simming, we're predominantly static, so the wearing location reminder can be turned off. In effect, when you move outside your boundary, it will revert to pass-through mode. Not really applicable for flight simulation, but the haptic feedback to your controllers, the amount of vibration can be set here. Okay, we're done here. Let's head over to the next tab, Games. FOV should be set to normal unless you have the appropriate lenses. The next item is image quality, and this one is critically important. You have 3 default settings, low, medium and high. High is 100% the default resolution of the VR headset, medium is 75%, and low is 50%. In the case of the Pimax Crystal Light, for example, that would be 2880 by 2880 pixels per eye at 100%. I don't recommend selecting auto. By reducing the percentage, you are reducing the number of pixels that have to be processed. The less processing you have, well, the faster the PC can react, and in essence, the smoother the flight. But the penalty, of course, is visual clarity. There is also a customize option where you can set the percentage of full resolution yourself. This is very useful if you're struggling for performance. If you've got something like the 5090, you can run it at 100% on the Crystal Super or Crystal Light. If your GPU is one tier down, 5080 or 7900 XTX, you can experiment from about 75% moving upwards. I found something in a region of about 90% works well. And of course this is all subject to your in-sim settings. Using DLSS in quality mode will allow you to move that percentage up. If you're in the 4070 Ti region, I would recommend running at the medium setting. GPU upscaling doesn't really apply if you're using Microsoft Flight Simulator. This in effect allows you to opt for the NVIDIA DLSS option, or alternatively you also have the option to select AMD's version of the super sampling. FSR. Note FSR can be used with both AMD and NVIDIA GPUs. As Microsoft Flight Simulator have both these options built in, you should leave this on none, as it will conflict with your in-sim settings and further reduce visual fidelity. But obviously will be useful if you're using other applications or games that don't have these performance enhancements baked in. Have the option to enhance sharpness. Setting of 0 is off. Once again, for Microsoft Flight Simulator, have this off, as once again it will conflict with in-sim settings. Excessive sharpening in simulation can create shimmers. Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 has an option to enable foveated rendering. So once again, I recommend that you leave the foveated rendering, dynamic foveated rendering off and enable in sim. Quad views is inherently supported in sim, but for those of you using this outside of Microsoft Flight Simulator, quad views can be a confusing term. In essence, it creates a central area of high resolution and the area outside that boundary at a lower resolution, thus increasing performance. Does this for each eye, thus quad, or 4 views, or more accurately, 4 resolutions. And you also have the option to change the size of the high resolution boundary box, so you can enlarge or reduce the size of the high resolution central image. In the case of fixed foveated rendering, there is central priority rendering. Once again, leave this off and enable foveated rendering in sim. Smart smoothing is basically frame generation for VR, as it inserts one artificial frame between each rendered frame, thus improving performance. Pimax still need to do some work on this. Performance is erratic. I suggest you leave that off. As mentioned earlier, here you have the option to lock it to half the frame rate. Again, you can set this in sim, and that is my recommendation, to have it off. And again, depending on your system, this can enhance performance in terms of reducing stutters, pauses and the like. I also recommend that the hidden area mask is enabled. This again can help with performance, as it blocks or masks parts of the rendered image that you're not looking at. Under the General tab, there's one important setting, and that is the OpenXR runtime. Make sure that is set to Pimax OpenXR for Microsoft Flight Simulator. Moving on now to the Advanced tab. This is where you can set your IPD offsets. If you've measured your IPD and set it, as shown earlier, but things don't feel quite right, perhaps you have astigmatism or something in one eye, here you can make minor adjustments, both horizontal and vertical, for each eye. Or alternatively, of course, you can get prescription lenses, which would be my recommendation. Local dimming, where available, can be adjusted here and offers a number of advantages. The main one, of course, is it reduces blooming and sometimes a halo effect, which you can see at night, and can also enhance contrast. This setting is very much a personal preferences one, it's trial and error, to see what suits you best. Here you can also enable pass-through. Personally, I have that off, as I don't use it, and you can set a key or button. And lastly, and something I haven't tried, is motion compensation, used for motion rigs, utilizing the controllers that came with the VR headset. Whenever making changes, don't forget to apply, and that's your basic overview of Pimax Play. The next sections apply directly to Microsoft Flight Simulator. I strongly recommend that you use an application called DLSS Swapper. I'll leave links in the notes below, and this allows you to update the version of DLSS for both Microsoft Flight Simulator 2020 and 24. The sims are currently using some considerably older versions. There are updates available for DLSS, frame generation, and FSR. Update them all. For purposes of supersampling, you can now select the DLSS preset directly from this application, and in this case I recommend preset K. Updating the DLSS brings performance improvements and greater clarity to DLSS modes. There's a whole lot of videos out on how to use the application. Just do a search on Google or YouTube. For those of you with NVIDIA GPUs and using the NVIDIA app, always make sure your drivers are up to date. But what we're most interested here is the Graphics tab. In this instance, I'm going to select Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024. I don't allow this app to optimize my flight sim settings. It does a wonderfully poor job at that. But we're going to scroll down to Driver Settings and select DLSS Override Model Presets. We're going to select the first option available and change from Use 3D Application Settings to Latest. And that by default will change the selection for the DLSS frame generation and super resolution. Under super resolution, just as we could in DLSS Swapper, we can choose the model preset. Whenever making changes, don't forget to hit apply. If we select the DLSS override frame generation, this is where we can change it from the default ×2 to ×3 or ×4. This relates to the number of artificial frames inserted between each rendered frame. I recommend here leave it at Use 3D Application Settings, depending on your use case of course, but the visual penalty by using ×3 or ×4 is not worth the performance gain, in my opinion. For 50 series GPUs, you'll also get the option for the DLSS Override Super Resolution. I recommend you leave it at Use the 3D Application Settings. You can change this in Sim. The only other setting change I make here is under the GPU Power Management mode. I set that to Prefer Maximum Performance. This is a small performance enhancement that stops the GPU from throttling down when not busy. Let's have a look now at some of the in-sim settings that can impact performance when in VR. Please note in many instances I'll be generalizing here, as the required settings that will suit you depend to a large degree on what type of flying you do. Low to the ground, texture, trees and buildings will be more important. Up in a tube liner, those details may not be critical, but cockpit resolution, paramount. As I tend to fly many different aircraft in both built-up and bush environments, my selection of settings that suit me are based on a set-and-forget principle. That means they're good enough that I can fly in any environment whilst maintaining acceptable performance levels. The anti-aliasing mode you choose is of critical importance. I'm currently in TAA mode. This is a 1:1 render scale and therefore will provide you with excellent clarity in the display, but you do need a fair amount of GPU grunt here, as it is relatively heavy on your system. This is my preferred mode, performance permitting. when in Microsoft Flight Simulator in VR, the actual number of FPS that you're achieving is not important, so don't get hung up on that. It's all about the smoothness of the flight and how freely you're able to look about. Yes, in a first-person shooter you're probably going to need 60 or 90 FPS. That's not the case for something slow-moving like Flight Sim. There's only one good FPS, and that's the one that gives you a smooth flight. Any stutters you see here are in the recording and not in the VR headset. If you're struggling with performance, don't hesitate to select DLSS Super Resolution. This, as mentioned previously, is an upscaling utility, can significantly reduce the load on your system. The amount of upscaling that takes place depends on the mode that you select. For the Pimax Crystal Light or Super, I personally would select Quality and if necessary make adjustments to the overall resolution in Pimax Play to get the best impact. You can also select DLAA mode, Deep Learning Anti-Aliasing, as one of the options within DLSS. This provides excellent clarity, but is not gentle on the resource requirements. Enough said, let's move on. Returning to my preferred TAA mode, I maintain resolution at 100%. Any changes I wanted to make, I would make in the Pimax Play software, and I have foveated rendering on to aid performance. The max frame rate option allows you to limit the number of FPS. For initial testing, have this off. Here, for example, you could set it to half the refresh rate, as opposed to using the Pimax Play option. Caution using this facility, as you could inadvertently, if you set it wrong, be limiting your performance. Through the developer mode, I've enabled the FPS counter, and as I move the slider so you can see the FPS change, it'll go up as far as the GPU can cope. In my case, today I'm using a 5090. I usually have this off, to be honest, but if I had it on, I'd set it to 45, which is half of 90 Hz. As explained briefly, if using the 72 Hz mode, I would set it to 36. Just want to mention again, don't have this enabled when you are doing your initial testing to find your sweet spot. The other setting that I want to highlight are dynamic settings. And it's clear to me that a lot of people don't really understand how this operates. When you enable it, I'm just going to turn off the frame counter quickly. That's better. When you enable it, you get a slider and you can set the frame rate. Minimum is 15. This is Asobo's implementation of Auto FPS in effect. And the way it works is this. It sits idle and does nothing, providing the FPS you achieve remains above, emphasis above, the frame rate target that you've set. The moment your FPS drops below the set target rate, the sim will automatically start reducing texture quality, thus load on the system, boosting your FPS back up to or above the targeted frame rate. Set the target frame to high, and the system's going to be changing your textures left, right, and center. This ironically can induce stutters and pauses, but the implementation is far too aggressive in degrading textures and too slow, in my opinion, in bringing them back up. My strongest recommendation is don't use it at this time. It lacks consistency. Let's now turn our attention to global rendering settings. The first setting we're going to focus on is our TLOD or terrain level of detail. Of all the settings, this is the big one. You'd be forgiven if you thought the purpose of this setting was to define the amount of detail that you can see on the terrain. But that is not the primary function that this setting does. I've mentioned this before, and arguably it should be renamed into terrain draw distance. The sim draws a circle around you in the sim and populates that with detail. If you have this set at 50, well, the circle is very tight around the actual aircraft itself. And as you fly, you'll probably see quite a lot of scenery popping in and out as it redraws that circle. Set it at 300 and it draws a large circle around you. This puts additional load on the system as it has to populate a much larger area, and thus can dramatically affect performance. I mentioned at the beginning of this video it was a balancing act, and that's certainly true in this case. The higher you move up your TLOD or terrain level of detail, well, you'll have to make compromises elsewhere to accommodate for extra load on your system. For something in the 4070 Ti range, I'd recommend it be set at 100. If you have a fairly beefy system, then setting it between 150 and 200 would be my recommendation. The other one to keep your eye on is the object level of detail. OLOD in Microsoft Flight Simulator 2024 is far more demanding than it was in the previous version. There are many more LODs. You should experiment with this. I leave mine on 100. Off-screen terrain pre-caching. This again can have an impact on your performance. and it determines how much of the data it will download and process with regards to where you are in the sim, and whether or not you're looking at it. Ultra, for example, will download a 360 degree around your current position and download and process that data even if you never look at it. Recommended here, again depending on your system, at medium to high. Enabling displacement mapping enables the 3D on the ground so you can drive over boulders and rocks and so on. For me, it's part of the immersion, and having it on is essential. But for you, depending on the type of flying you do, as I mentioned earlier, up to you. When it comes to building trees, plants, rocks and grass, that's really a matter of experimentation. Just be aware that trees is quite a heavy hitter. Turning this down a notch or two can make a significant improvement. The volumetric cloud setting can have an impact on your performance depending on your particular weather settings. And to be honest, at low and medium settings they look pretty awful. Texture resolution should in effect be left at high, and your anisotropic filtering can be at times 16. You can try it off, but you will probably get some shimmering. In a high-end VR headset like the Pimax Crystal Super, you can try times 8. Water waves should also be taken note of. When it's windy and they're animated, that again can have an impact on your performance. My personal recommendation when it comes to shadows, turn them down. That is especially applicable on those VR headsets that have lower resolutions, as you just won't be able to see any difference. Ray trace shadows and ray march reflections I have off. Bottom line, they're poorly implemented in VR. Windshield effects will denote how detailed or otherwise things on the windscreen such as rain and snow are. Ambient occlusion is no longer the big hitter that it was in DX11. The glass cockpit refresh rate is an important one as it reflects how quickly the cockpit information will be updated, altitude, speed and so on. My preference here is to have it on high and compromise elsewhere if I have to. With the most recent update of Sim Update 3 Beta, there's a whole lot of new options here, many of which I haven't had time to investigate. Again, they're likely to have an impact on performance, as it will affect both the quality and quantity of people and aircraft in your vicinity. The only comment I would say for those on multiplayer, air traffic quality and air traffic variety needs to be set to high or ultra to achieve best visibility. The other one really to take note of is road traffic, how many cars, vans, etc. you see in Sim. Cautious with this one because it can affect your performance considerably. And fauna, which is animals, really up to you. I normally have this on high, but as mentioned numerous times, it's a matter of what you prefer and how you fly. A subject such as this is almost never ending in terms of how much coverage you can do. But again, the purpose was to cover off the basics and give you a helping hand. For 2 excellent VR headsets. I'm often asked if I still use the OpenXR toolkit. And my answer is no, I don't, out of personal preference. The application does remain compatible with both versions of the sim, although a number of the functions will conflict, as they're now built into the sims directly. The less you have running in the background, the better. As always, thank you very much for joining me today. Take care, I'll see you all again very soon. And ciao for now, Captains.